Well, hello everybody. I have a really interesting interview today. I found a YouTube channel, Libertarian Realist, and it's by a gentleman who has some very, very confronting things to say, some very non-PC things to say about race wars, race, biology, genetics, and a whole bunch of other things. And I'm really looking forward to this because I love controversy. I love things that are non-PC, and the conversation is actually a little bit uncomfortable for me, and so that's often a good indication that I'm about to be exposed to something new and learn something. So, Realist, welcome to the conversation.
Well, it's a pleasure to be with you and your listeners. Greetings from Montana, and I certainly aim to pursue the truth wherever it leads, regardless of whether it's PC or not.
I really love that phrase. I'm very much in that camp. I will follow truth wherever it leads. I don't fear truth in any way, shape, or form. And so, if this is if we get somewhere cool and interesting and new, and somewhere that I hadn't thought about before, then that's great. So, I don't know. Are you comfortable just starting off a little bit? I saw a video of yours just before I had a chance to, and you pointed out the four pillars of a successful society. If you think that's a great place to launch from, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, the four pillars of a successful society, in my view, are a society's genetic composition, a society's freedoms, and its borders, and finally its aesthetics, which I construe broadly to mean its culture, its language, its architecture. It's kind of what Ayn Rand would describe as its sense of life.
Okay, cool. So I think the one that we agree on pretty much unchallenged is freedom.
Uh-huh.
There's libertarian in your title there. I would consider myself, just so you know where I'm coming from, I would probably consider myself ANCAP, or at the very least, very, very strongly libertarian. So we're both on the same page there in terms of freedom is an incredibly important component to a free society. The idea of genetics being an important component to a free society is somewhat new to me. Would you like to expand on that?
Well, what we know from all studies of heritability is that all human personality traits carry a genetic component, whether it's intelligence, which studies show is about 70 to 80% heritable, at least within the United States. And what's also heritable is people's criminal proclivities and their compatibility with liberty. Political views also have a inherited component. And so what we've done in the United States and the Western world for the past couple of generations is try to sweep aside the whole field of genetics and remove genetics entirely from our analysis because I guess we're afraid that become Nazis or something if we consider genetics. But this is a denial of science. This is egalitarianism gone to an absurd extreme. And people on the left completely deny genetics, and people among the right and libertarians also do. Instead of ascribing all human variation to oppressive social structures, what libertarians will sometimes do is ascribe everything to individual choice. Well, okay, we can concede that there is such a thing as individual choice, but it too is influenced by genetic factors. I mean, where do my choices come from? They come from my nature, which was given to me genetically, and to my experiences in the world. So we have to take into account genetics if we truly want to build a free society.
Okay, so this is not a subject that I'm well researched on, but you've made some claims there that there's solid science suggesting that some of these things are 70, 80% genetics. I'm sure you've had this conversation many times with people who are better research on the subject. Is there an alternative view, or is it the alternative view just not to be spoken about because it's PC? Is there an actual alternative scientific different perspective?
Well, since the Human Genome Project, there's really, among people who actually study the hard science, there's no debate about the fact that a trait such as intelligence or IQ is at least 50% genetic. And the American Psychological Association, based largely on twin studies, comes up with an estimate of 75% genetic, which means that 75% of the variation that we observe among individuals in the United States is attributable to underlying genetic variation. Now, some people will say, okay, we can accept that there's this individual variation that's due to genetics, but they'll try to claim that all group differences are environmental, which is a really difficult argument to try to make. But people can say that theoretically, okay, we can't conclude that there's necessarily group differences, but the evidence for group differences, in my view, is just as strong.
Right, I'm really interested on this topic because I have a son who turns 1 in about 2 weeks, and I'm a first-time dad, and it's a really enjoyable process. And I've actually had a bunch of nieces and nephews, and was quite involved in their child raising. And I always was of the impression that it was very much the environment and nurture and not nature. But you're saying the science is contradicting that now.
Well, I mean, it's the commonly held view that nature, or that rather nurture, is more important than nature. And it's kind of counterintuitive to think that parental involvement, schools, and social policies are less important than the actual DNA of which people are composed. But all the evidence suggests that what's most important in influencing a child's ultimate outcome and development into adulthood is the genes that he possesses.
Right. Now, I'm really fascinated in how this, because I've thought about this topic before, and I was trying to think about how can you do these experiments and control for all the variables. You mentioned twin studies before, but can you describe the experiments and how they manage to control for the same upbringing and things like that?
Well, I mean, you can always find things that studies haven't controlled for or would never be able to control for. And so if you want to be really obstinate, you can say that they're completely invalid, but then you would be basically denying all science and all experimentation, because we all conduct experiments within a context of our limited knowledge and our limited capacities to control for all these variables. But basically, the twin studies, they try to compare uh, people who are biologically identical, virtually identical, and compare them in the same environment versus twins who are separated and raised in completely different environments. And there are actually studies of twins who have been separated at birth, never seen each other for years or decades, and then they go back and look at their personality traits and their life circumstances and outcomes, and they find that the similarities are extraordinary. These are people who have never met each other, and yet as soon as they meet, they immediately almost see another self when they meet their estranged twin.
Right. That's really really interesting. Okay, so I mean, I don't think I have no problems, or I think it's pretty obvious that to make a statement like, like blacks are better at like basketball. If I walk into a gymnasium, I'm asked to pick a basketball team, and there's, all things being equal, I'm going to choose a predominantly black team, just because
And there you go.
I know they're better at basketball, right? So this isn't a particularly. I hope it's not a particularly controversial statement. I think that's pretty obvious. So I don't. I mean, to me, to think that it would stop at one particular trait, like a basketball trait or something, doesn't make a lot of sense. It makes more sense to me that there would be differences in races and things like that, and from things like IQ and personality traits, and you mentioned propensity to criminality and things like that. So I'm certainly open to this topic. So maybe, Joe, is there somewhere else that you can take us a little bit further down this path? Are you suggesting that there is a this might be incorrectly worded, but a good race and a bad race, or certain races that you would want in your society and certain races that you wouldn't?
I think it's important to conceive of group differences, such as racial differences, in terms of distributions. So, in terms of athleticism, there are some blacks who are not athletic at all and don't have the capacity to play professional basketball. And then there are some whites on the high end of basketball ability. And the same is true with intelligence and other traits. So there are no real categorical differences between the races in terms of the traits that we would regard as socially significant. But nevertheless, the distributions are significant, because when we're looking at an entire population, they are highly predictive of group outcomes. So in terms of, the so-called achievement gap in school and educational attainment, which shows up everywhere. I mean, it's so persistent, it's so consistent across every state, every school district, and virtually every school. It's the same hierarchy. It's the Asians who tend to score the highest, at least in mathematical and science aptitude, followed by whites, followed by Hispanics, followed by blacks. And so, yes, on an individual basis, there are very smart, high achieving blacks. But on a whole population basis, this is where the averages ultimately rule out.
Okay, so once we observe these issues and these distributions, what's your next level of logic beyond that? What are the observations you're making that okay, because we've observed this, then we should do what? Or what are your statements after that?
Well, first, I'll start with the policy implication that should be least controversial, at least among libertarians. Okay, so we have the left constantly haranguing the society, white people in general, about the achievement gaps and about how blacks are underrepresented, and they're calling for government interventions. They're funding so-called white privilege training to inculcate guilt among whites for the fact that they tend to earn more income than black people do. But of course, Asians tend to earn more income than whites do. So we never hear about Asian privilege. Nevertheless, understanding that there is a genetic basis for these disparities is the only way to fundamentally, on a metaphysical level, defeat the left's calls for things like affirmative action and mandatory white privilege training. So, that, in my view, is why all libertarians should embrace the science of heritability as applied to group differences. Now, the more controversial implication is that this is relevant for things like immigration policy. And I believe that a free society that defines itself as free as against most of the rest of the world, which is either unfree or extremely hostile to freedom, must have an immigration policy that selects for people among the rest of the world who are compatible with liberty. And it's impossible to judge every individual on an individual basis when it comes to something as broad as immigration policy. So that is where we can take group differences into account, and not just race, and even maybe not primarily race. But for example, we heard Donald Trump's recent call to ban Muslim immigration, at least on a temporary basis. And that, in my view, is a legitimate proposal because immigration is not a right. When the government accepts people in and grants them citizenship, the government is taking a positive action. The government is assuming a power. And we as libertarians should be concerned with limiting the government's power and its ability to create new citizens out of the 7 billion people in the world. We want it to be highly, highly selective for compatibility. And people who say that, oh, we have to have freedom of religion, that's all these Republicans now are bashing Donald Trump in the name of freedom of religion. Oh, he can't do this. This is beyond the pale. Well, Donald Trump was one of the only Republicans who was right in opposing the Iraq War. So all these Republicans who are crying these crocodile tears over the prospect of limiting Muslim immigration, most of these people are the same ones who were for bombing and killing hundreds of thousands of Muslims in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, and Libya and Syria, and all these other places where we have no interest in being in. We have an interest in keeping all their troubles away from us.
Going back to your first point, the idea about the libertarian perspective is, I mean, the role of government is not to positively discriminate for any reason under any circumstances. And so the idea of stopping this affirmative action type stuff and making up for any kinds of perceived errors or wrongs or white guilt or anything, that's a very easy decision for a libertarian to not participate in. The second part is, I don't think it's a violation of any kind of non-aggression principle or anything like that, any kind of core libertarian beliefs to suggest that there should be borders, and because this comes down to property rights. I mean, any individual who owns a piece of land or whatever has the right to invite or not invite anybody onto that land at all, collectively in larger groups and like HOAs and let's go nationhood. then I think that's a perfectly legitimate right to invite or not invite anybody you choose. Do you get much resistance from libertarians as a principle that's false?
Yes, and I think that there are some libertarian arguments for open borders that are um, legitimate, at least, internally consistent. And there are some that are just contradictory. And I think the idea that there is a positive right for everybody in the world to migrate wherever they want is a complete misconstrual of libertarian principles, and implicitly it's a denial of private property rights.
Yeah, I'd
Because
agree.
in a world of private property, there would be fences. There would be all kinds of restrictions on people's ability to move where they wanted to move. And that's not a violation of anybody's freedom. So if you're going to say that the whole United States has to be open to the whole world, you're implicitly conceiving of the United States as a one huge collective that requires a central government to open the whole land area's borders, because in a world of private property, that would not be the case.
Yeah, I completely agree. I don't think borders are a contradiction to libertarian thought or philosophy in any way, shape, or form. And I'd even go so far, I've been thinking this lately, I would say if there's going to be a government, it's, it's almost like the duty of government, kind of going back to the founding principles of the United States. They wanted many small sovereign states effectively competing for population, and it was through that competition that limited the abuses and the tyranny of any one particular state. Income tax didn't come about in any particular state until it came about federally, when there was no escape from it. And so I would argue that the purpose of any kind of government is to win as many selective people to that community, to that environment, to make it prosper. Does that resonate with you at all?
Yes, I would completely agree. And if you eliminate borders, then you eliminate the ability to expel people from society. And I mean, that would be a solution to mass incarceration, right? Just deport people, get them out. And that's how you create a free society. You select for a population that is going to value and be compatible with freedom.
Well, I do have an issue with deportation, because that might be an instance of now you're depositing somebody on somebody else's land. And so I'm not sure if you quite have the right to do that.
Well, you'd have to either work with other governments
If find someone
and
willing to take them, sure.
yeah, I mean, we can say, for example, take criminals and they've served out a minimum amount of their sentence and they're eligible for parole. Well, we could say, okay, if you want parole, we're going to deport you. If you don't want to be deported, then you can serve out the rest of your sentence. And all the governments in the poor countries that we are giving foreign aid to, we can offer them a payment in consideration for their willingness to accept deportees.
Right. Yep, that makes sense. So it's a voluntary solution, and as a libertarian, philosophy has no problem with that,
And
to my knowledge.
yeah,
So,
and I would actually say that it would be beneficial for a neighboring country to a libertarian country to be an egalitarian open borders country, because then we could we wouldn't even have to pay them. If we have a neighboring country that has completely open egalitarian borders, then we can send them all of our criminals, and we would never have to deal with prison or anything else. Uh, and so, um, yeah, I think that an open borders country next to a libertarian country would be very convenient to have.
so, so you're certainly not anti-immigration of all sorts. That's not your position. That's not what you're advocating.
Right, I'm advocating for selective immigration.
Okay, that's fine. Again, I don't think there's any principle that is that contradicts. Certainly, no libertarian principle that contradicts. There's a condition or position or an argument there for charitable immigration, like taking on somebody who you know to be not good for your society, but doing so in a charitable way to try and do so for the rest of the world, to try and do so to improve humanity or whatever else.
Yeah.
What's your argument for that, or against that?
Well, that's what refugee resettlement is. It's completely altruistic. We take people's experiences being traumatized or in war conditions or being persecuted as some sort of qualification for being a citizen or a resident of a country, which is completely backward. The fact that these people come from such troubled backgrounds and are basically economically not ready to even be self reliant. They have no cultural connections or compatibility with the Western governments, with the cultures in the West, whose governments are importing these people. So if you want to be charitable, then it should be up to individuals within a free society to contribute money to help the refugees in their own countries. It is not the purpose of government to use immigration policy as a charity. It's the purpose of government to use immigration policy as a means to protect and defend the liberties of its citizens.
I think that's a reasonable status and argument. Again, just from the, I know we've probably got a lot of people who are not libertarians listening, and they're probably baffled by this whole conversation. But in terms of arguing from first principles, I think that everything you've said there is absolutely reasonable, albeit very non-PC. Let's talk a little bit about. You talked about in a free society there are fences and borders, and I understand there are to a degree, but I'm also always constantly reminding myself to never predict what the free market will do, because it is so wise and so clever. It does incredible things. And I was chatting to Jeffrey Tucker, not sure if you're familiar with him, but a great libertarian. Yeah. And we were talking about this concept, and he was talking about that there is a particular zone, I think he lives in the city of Atlanta, and there was this just disastrous neighborhood that the government had been in control of for like 100 years, and they tried 10 different things. It was a power plant, it was a free housing for poor people, it was all these different things, right? And it was just constantly a disaster, just year after year after year a disaster. Finally they said, I give up on it, we just give it to someone, they can do whatever they want with it. And an entrepreneur came along and made up this, there's like private police force on there, and it's a very libertarian little world. And my instinct was that there'll probably be, they put up fences, and they did, and the answer was no, they didn't. They didn't put up fences at all. It's completely open. People can come and go as they please. But there's things that some libertarians would find offensive, like things like there's no smoking on the streets. But it's private land, so they can make up whatever rules they want, right? But there are no borders. Anyone can come and go as they want. There's private police walking around, and they'll ask you to put out your cigarettes. They'll ask you to please put a shirt on while you're on the street, and all these kinds of rules. And I thought, well, that's interesting. In a free society, it's just someone's private property. They make whatever they want, and they're trying to make it as appealing for people as possible. And in doing so, they've made open borders and all these rules. And so I don't think there's necessarily. I've always found that libertarian and that freedom is generally very, very inclusive. That's my take on things. I think a free world, there would not be significant borders. To a degree, and I'll give you a corollary to that as well. In Sao Paulo, in that conversation with Jeffrey Tucker I was talking about, he was talking about a place he went to in Sao Paulo in Brazil, and he said, no, the private communities have huge walls and huge fences, and I could understand how that made more sense because there was such a massive disparity in the wealth between those people. It just didn't mix, whereas in a suburb in Atlanta, it did. But I think the trend in libertarian society is actually to pull down walls and to pull down borders and to be very, very inclusive. But I also understand that side of things, that you absolutely have the right. If there is a culture that is just, or an ideology or anything that is just so parasitic and aggressive and destructive to your own, you absolutely have the right to keep it out. So maybe you want to talk about some of the, and I'm not sure what they are. Are they cultures? Are they races? Are they religions? Are they whatever? What are the things that you think are detrimental to American society, detrimental to freedom? And what would you suggest that we what is your suggestion? Should we have zero immigration for that at all? Should we have smaller numbers for it? What's your position for that?
Well, I don't prescribe universally a libertarian immigration policy for all countries, jurisdictions, or private communities everywhere. That's what the open borders absolutists do. They say that there has to be free immigration for everyone from the whole world everywhere. I say that immigration policy has to be contextual. It has to be considered on the basis of a region's neighbors, their populations, their levels of hostility or compatibility, et cetera, et cetera. So in the case of the United States, maybe ideally, I would break up the United States into smaller countries that are, more regionally coherent. But just assuming that the United States, taken as a whole, has to have a single immigration policy, well, first of all, I would say that we have to get the policy itself right and the perverse incentives eliminated, such as refugee resettlements, welfare for illegal immigrants, in-state tuition, et cetera, et cetera. All these incentives for freeloaders have to be gotten rid of. And the qualifications for attaining citizenship have to be such that only compatible people who end up here can actually ever hope to attain citizenship. Now, in that context, if we get the policies right, maybe we wouldn't need to build a wall. Maybe we wouldn't need to have a whole lot of resources poured into deportations. So I'm not somebody who's wants to wall off necessarily my free society, but I do reserve that as an option for defending that society's freedoms.
Yeah, I think that's perfectly reasonable, and I wanted to get to that later. Yeah, I think a free society would be extremely unattractive for people who don't like free societies, people who are destructive to it. And so I don't think if you once you get rid of all that welfare and all of that nonsense, then it becomes and I also think justice in a free society would be very, very swift and tough. If you come in with criminality tendencies, it is not going to be a pleasant place for you. It is not going to be tolerated in any way, shape or form. And so I think it would be a very, very unattractive environment, and I don't think a particularly strong immigration policy would even be necessary, but I understand the principle, and I do agree with you that I think it's valid to reserve that right should the population see fit. I also want to mention, I can't even fathom how it's even controversial to discuss some kind of immigration policy. I mean, if you live in a democracy, the definition of democracy is mob rule. If you get 51% of the vote to do something, then that's the way it is. That becomes the law. So all you have to do is take the extreme example. Well, okay, if you imported 400 million people to the United States who were advocates of Sharia law, then all of a sudden Sharia law would be the law of the land in the United States. So
Yep.
I can't even understand how it's the least bit controversial to say that we do need to control the numbers of certain types of people coming in certain ways. And once you've granted that principle, now it's just a matter of numbers, and it becomes very mathematical and a cost-benefit analysis. It's like, who do you want? Why do you want them? On what numbers do you want them? And things like that. So, yeah, do you find in your travels, do many people just resist the idea that there should be any kind of limits?
Yeah, I think you bring up a good point about democracy, because if you're an advocate of liberty, then you have to be concerned with restricting democracy to protect the rights of individuals. And for the same reasons, you have to be concerned with restricting the ability of hostile foreigners to come in and take control of or influence the political system in an adverse direction.
Yeah, that makes sense. What do you make of the race wars going on now, Black Lives Matter, any kind of commentary about that, and what's going on, the PC culture? Where is this ultimately, where does this end for us?
Well, it's going to end very badly if we don't get up the resolve to defend ourselves and say that no, we are not going to give in to all your demands. We're not going to resign from our jobs. We're not going to surrender our freedoms to you. Uh, yes, there are some issues of police brutality, but the statistics show that white violent criminals are actually more likely to be shot by the police than black violent criminals. So the idea that racism is this huge institutional problem that exists everywhere in society and explains all these racial disparities is a complete myth. It's been drummed up by the media. And honestly, I would like to just start ignoring all these people, all these ridiculous incidents that get hyped up, and start taking an offensive approach to race relations. By offensive, I mean being on offense in terms of pushing our agenda, which should be to get rid of all government mandated discriminatory programs such as affirmative action, and to hold uh, black people accountable, at least on an individual basis, uh, when they engage in activities that are violent, harmful, or destructive of liberty, and to do so without apology, and to end the ability of the race hustlers to extract from us unearned sympathy and unearned concessions because we feel guilty. No more. White guilt has to be ended.
I think when you restrict government to just the things that it's supposed to do, then the respect for law goes up massively, and I think the justice system becomes much more swift and much more significantly a significant deterrent, and it cuts out a lot of crime that we don't see right now, even though we have a much bigger government and a bigger justice department than we would otherwise like.
Yeah, and violent crime has actually been on a downtrend since the early 1990s, but over the past year, we've seen a spike up in cities such as Baltimore and St. Louis and other large cities with large black populations. And the Justice Department and the Obama administration are, I believe, deliberately trying to incite racial rage among inner city black communities. And so I hold them largely responsible.
Yeah, I don't think there's any question about an agenda there to try and create divisiveness. I think there's a definitely agenda there. There's gender wars going on, there's race wars going on, there's religious wars going on, and there is definitely the mainstream media, the politics behind it. Even Obama's even class wars. Obama's statement. If you built that, you didn't build that. Um,
Yeah.
there's there's to me it's a very very clear cut line that there's this deliberate attempt to incite this division in society. And do you have like much of a thought on that in terms of the background of that? Who's benefiting from this? Why is that there? Why is that agenda there?
Well, there's an entire race industry that benefits from creating artificial racial division, from the Al Sharptons to the Jesse Jacksons to all the diversity trainers that exist now in every university and major corporations, the Justice Department. All these people hold their jobs and their existence and their purpose of living to combating an imaginary white oppressive system.
Yeah, this the whole white guilt thing, and there's the male guilt, there's the white guilt, there's the rich guilt. It's never ending, and it's nonsense. It's just this we've and I did a video not too long ago, the comparison between when Bernie Sanders got kicked off his own stage by Black
Yeah.
Lives supporters, and compare that to the way Trump handled it. And I'm not a Trump fanboy by a long stretch, but there just seemed to be I love the way Trump handled that situation. It's just like, I mean, this is my room. I've organised this. People have come to listen to me. I'm going to ask you to leave nicely, and if you don't, you're trespassing. I'm going to have to escort you off, and if you fight, I'm going to escalate the violence until I achieve the goal of getting you off my property. And it's a self-respect thing. To let a couple of girls push you off your own stage is just a lack of self-respect, and I think it all comes back to this white guilt and this we're supposed to be apologetic for this false concepts of privilege.
Yes, white people have been taught and conditioned to be deferential to black people. And I'm not in 100% agreement with all of Donald Trump's policy positions, but I do think he's serving a useful purpose in this campaign insofar as he's opening up the debate and he's sort of slaying some of these formerly sacred, politically correct strictures. And now in political debates, I hope after Trump, candidates will be, uh, at least on the Republican side, more open, less pandering, less of a sellout. I like Trump's idea, a practice of not apologizing and, just speaking for the interests of his actual constituency instead of trying to pander to people for the sake of scoring media points to people who will never vote for him anyway.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you in terms of that is a very positive role that Trump is playing right now. So hopefully a lot of these things come into the mainstream conversation. They come out from the shadows. There's not something that we all talk about at home, but never in a more public sphere. And so, yeah, that's definitely going to be a good thing. Any final thoughts, Realist, before we wind up?
Well, we've touched on some areas that I've explored in my videos and my blog posts. You can find my YouTube channel, Libertarian Realist. And I've done a lot of travelogues from around the world. Last year, I visited over 20 countries in Europe and Asia. And I've also done videos on race and IQ and crime and immigration. So, anybody who's interested in finding out more on my take of these controversial subjects is welcome to check out my YouTube videos.
Awesome. Well, I really appreciate the time and thank you very much.
It's been a pleasure.
Take care. Bye bye.